The street was quiet under a heavy gray sky, and rain fell slowly, making the road shine under weak street lights. Officer Mark stood beside his patrol car, feeling tired but alert as his eyes moved from one side of the street to the other. He had worked this area for years and believed he understood everything about it. That belief had slowly turned into pride, and pride had turned into blind confidence. A dark sedan appeared at the corner and rolled forward at a calm speed. Mark watched it closely and felt a sudden urge to stop it, even though nothing looked wrong. He stepped into the road and raised his hand with firm authority. The car stopped smoothly and the engine hummed quietly. Inside the car sat a man named Tom, wearing simple clothes and carrying a calm expression. He had just returned from a long assignment and wanted nothing more than to reach home and rest. When the window lowered, Tom greeted the officer politely and waited. Mark asked for identification with a sharp voice. Tom handed over his license slowly and kept his hands visible. He followed every rule because he understood how tense moments could become. Mark glanced at the license but did not truly read it. His eyes moved quickly and his face hardened for reasons even he did not fully understand. Mark asked Tom where he was going and why he was in the area. Tom answered calmly and clearly without raising his voice. He explained he was returning home after work. His tone was respectful and steady. Something in Mark's mind refused to accept the simple truth. He stepped closer to the car and his hand moved near his weapon. The rain grew heavier and the silence between them felt heavy and uncomfortable. Mark ordered Tom to step out of the car. Tom paused for a brief moment, then obeyed without resistance. He opened the door slowly and stepped onto the wet road with his hands visible. His movements were careful and controlled. As Tom stood beside the car, Mark circled him while watching closely. His questions became sharper and more aggressive. Tom answered each one patiently, even when the words felt unfair. Tom finally spoke and calmly said that he worked for a federal agency. He said it without pride and without threat. He hoped the truth would ease the tension. Mark laughed and shook his head. He told Tom to stop lying and accused him of trying to escape trouble. His voice grew louder and his posture more aggressive. Without warning, Mark pulled his weapon and aimed it directly at Tom's chest. The sound of the rain seemed louder and time felt slower. Tom froze but kept his hands raised. Tom spoke softly and told Mark his full name and badge number. He explained again that he was on official duty earlier that day. His voice did not shake, even though the danger was clear. Mark refused to listen and backed away slightly while keeping his weapon aimed. He reached for his radio and called for backup. His message was rushed and filled with confidence. Tom remained still and focused on breathing. He knew that one wrong move could end everything. He thought about his family and the work he had dedicated his life to. Cars passed far away but no one stopped. The street felt isolated and cold. The rain soaked Tom's clothes but he did not move. At the station, the radio message echoed through the room. A senior officer heard the report and his expression changed instantly. The details did not sit right with him. The chief stood up quickly and grabbed his coat. Years of experience told him something was wrong. He knew the name Tom and understood the seriousness of the situation. Without wasting time, the chief left the station and headed toward the location. His face was calm but his mind was sharp and focused. Back on the street, Mark paced while keeping his weapon raised. He felt powerful and convinced he was right. He ignored Tom's calm behavior and steady voice. Tom looked straight ahead and waited. He trusted that truth would reach the right ears. The sound of sirens began to rise in the distance. The rain continued to fall as fate moved closer. The sound of distant sirens slowly grew louder as the rain continued to fall across the empty street. Officer Mark stood firm with his weapon raised and his eyes fixed on Tom. His grip was tight and his breathing was heavy even though he tried to appear calm. Tom remained still with his hands raised high and his body relaxed despite the danger surrounding him. He focused on staying calm and respectful because he knew fear could change everything. The cold rain soaked his clothes but he did not react. Mark began asking the same questions again, with more force in his voice. He demanded answers that had already been given. Tom replied each time using the same calm tone and simple words. The tension between them felt heavy and unbalanced. Mark felt challenged by Tom's calm behavior and steady confidence. Instead of calming down, Mark became more convinced that he was right. A patrol car arrived first and parked a short distance away. Another officer stepped out and observed the scene carefully. He noticed Tom's raised hands and calm posture immediately. The second officer spoke quietly and asked Mark what was happening. Mark responded loudly and claimed he had stopped a dangerous suspect. His words were firm and absolute. Tom turned his head slightly and calmly repeated his name and role. He explained that he had already shared his information. He asked respectfully for the situation to slow down. The second officer listened closely and felt something was off. Tom did not act like someone trying to cause trouble. His voice was controlled and his body language showed discipline. More patrol cars arrived and the streets slowly filled with flashing lights. Rain reflected the red and blue glow across the road. Neighbors peeked from windows but stayed inside. Mark felt empowered by the growing crowd of officers. He raised his voice and continued giving orders. His confidence grew louder as his authority went unquestioned. Tom noticed how the situation was shifting and chose his words carefully. He calmly asked for a supervisor to be present. His request was respectful and clear. Mark reacted sharply and dismissed the request. He told Tom to remain silent and follow orders. His voice carried frustration and pride. The other officers exchanged quick glances. Some felt uneasy but said nothing. The pressure of the moment kept them still. Suddenly, a black unmarked vehicle turned onto the street and stopped behind the patrol cars. A tall man stepped out wearing a long coat and a serious expression. It was the chief. The chief walked forward slowly and confidently despite the rain. His eyes scanned the scene and took in every detail. He noticed Tom first and then looked directly at Mark. The chief asked calmly what was going on. His voice was firm but controlled. The entire street seemed to quiet at his presence. Mark quickly began explaining his version of events. He spoke fast and with confidence, believing his actions would be supported. He pointed toward Tom and accused him of lying. The chief listened without interrupting and kept his eyes on Mark. When Mark finished, the chief turned his attention to Tom. Tom lowered his voice slightly and spoke with respect. He repeated his name and role once again. He explained that he had followed every instruction given. The chief nodded slowly as recognition crossed his face. He knew Tom and understood his role very well. His jaw tightened as he processed what had happened. The chief stepped closer to Mark and asked him if he had verified the information. Mark hesitated for a brief moment before answering. His confidence faded slightly. The chief asked again, and this time his tone was sharper. Mark admitted he had not fully checked the details. A heavy silence fell over the group. Rain continued to fall and sirens faded into the background. The truth was now clear. The chief took a step forward and looked Mark directly in the eyes. His voice was calm but filled with authority. He asked Mark to lower his weapon immediately. Mark slowly lowered his arm as doubt and fear appeared on his face. His earlier confidence disappeared. The chief reached forward and firmly removed the badge from Mark's chest. The sound of metal echoed softly in the rain. Gasps spread quietly through the officers standing nearby. No one spoke as the moment unfolded. The chief told Mark that his actions had crossed a line and damaged trust. His words were controlled but powerful. Mark stood frozen and unable to respond. The weight of his actions finally reached him. Tom slowly lowered his hands when the chief signaled it was safe. Relief passed through his face, but his expression remained serious. The chief turned to Tom and apologized calmly and sincerely. He thanked him for his patience and professionalism. Tom nodded and accepted the words with dignity. He understood the importance of accountability. The flashing lights reflected across the wet street as the moment settled. The rain continued to fall as consequences began to take shape. The rain slowly weakened as the flashing lights continued to glow across the street. Officers stood quietly unsure of where to look or what to say. The moment had changed the energy of everyone present. Mark remained frozen with his head lowered and his shoulders tense. The badge was gone, and with it the confidence he once carried. His uniform felt heavy and uncomfortable. The chief stepped away from Mark and turned his attention back to Tom. He spoke calmly and asked if Tom was safe. Tom nodded and said he was fine but shaken. The chief ordered the officers to stand down and clear the area. His voice carried authority without anger. One by one the patrol cars powered down and officers returned to their vehicles. As the street emptied, the quiet returned slowly. Rainwater flowed along the curb and washed away the tension left behind. Mark was asked to step aside and wait. He obeyed without protest and leaned against his patrol car. His face showed confusion and regret. The chief spoke with another senior officer and gave clear instructions. An internal report would be opened immediately. Mark would not be returning to duty that night. Tom stood nearby and watched the process unfold. He felt tired but grateful that the truth had reached the right person. His hands trembled slightly as the stress finally released. The chief approached Tom again and offered to drive him home. Tom accepted after a brief pause. He did not want to be alone after everything that had happened. They walked toward the unmarked vehicle while rain continued to fall lightly. The street felt different now, calmer but heavier with meaning. Inside the car the silence lasted for a few moments. The chief focused on the road while Tom looked out the window. Street lights passed slowly as they drove. The chief finally spoke and apologized again. He admitted the situation should never have reached that point. His voice was sincere and steady. Tom listened quietly and appreciated the honesty. He said accountability mattered more than words. The chief nodded in agreement. They spoke about responsibility and trust. The conversation was simple but meaningful. Both men understood the weight of their roles. When they reached Tom's home, the rain had stopped completely. The night air felt cool and clean. Tom stepped out of the car and thanked the chief. He stood for a moment and watched the vehicle drive away. Inside his home, Tom sat quietly and let the silence settle. He replayed the night in his mind and felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. At the station, Mark sat alone in a quiet room. The walls felt closer than before. He stared at the empty space on his uniform where the badge once sat. An investigator entered and began asking questions calmly. Mark answered slowly and carefully. Each word felt heavier than the last. He spoke about the stop and his decisions. He avoided excuses and struggled to explain his thoughts. The truth began to surface piece by piece. The investigator listened and wrote notes without judgment. The process was professional and firm. Mark realized how his assumptions had shaped his actions. The realization was painful and uncomfortable. Days passed, and the incident spread quietly through the department. Conversations changed and awareness grew. Officers reflected on their conduct and choices. Training sessions were scheduled and policies reviewed. Leadership made it clear that accountability was not optional. Tom returned to work and continued his duties with focus. He did not speak publicly about the incident. He believed actions spoke louder than words. The chief addressed the department and spoke about trust and responsibility. His message was clear and direct. Mistakes would be addressed, not ignored. Mark faced the outcome of the investigation. His future remained uncertain, but the lesson was permanent. The department began to change in small but meaningful ways. Conversations became more thoughtful and awareness deepened. Tom watched from a distance and felt hopeful. The night had been difficult, but it had sparked something important. As time moved forward, the memory of the rain-soaked street remained. It served as a reminder of how quickly power could turn dangerous without understanding. The story was not about one night alone. It was about learning and accountability. The city continued to move and breathe. Life went on, but the lesson stayed. Weeks passed, and the city slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The rain-soaked street became just another road in memory, but its impact stayed alive in quiet ways. People moved through their days unaware of how one night had shifted many lives. Tom continued his work with steady focus and calm discipline. He carried the lesson of that night without bitterness. He believed that real change came from patience and accountability. At work, Tom noticed subtle changes around him. Conversations felt more thoughtful and choices felt more careful. Trust was being rebuilt step by step. The chief followed through on every promise he had made. New training sessions were held and discussions were encouraged. Officers were reminded that authority carried responsibility. The department atmosphere slowly transformed. Questions were welcomed instead of dismissed. Listening became just as important as command. Mark's situation moved forward through formal review. He attended meetings and evaluations quietly. Each day forced him to reflect on his actions. He spent long hours thinking about that night. The rain, the silence, and the moment he raised his weapon replayed again and again. He understood now how fear mixed with pride could cause harm. Mark attended counseling sessions and training programs. He listened more than he spoke. Growth came slowly but sincerely. Though his role changed, his lesson remained powerful. He began to understand that respect was not automatic and trust must be earned. Tom and Mark crossed paths once during a scheduled meeting. The moment was quiet and respectful. No words were needed. Tom nodded calmly and Mark returned the gesture. Both understood the weight of what had happened. The city council reviewed policies and introduced new guidelines. Transparency became a priority. Community meetings were held and voices were heard. Neighbors who once felt unseen now felt included. Conversations replaced silence. Trust began to grow. The chief stood before the department once again and spoke about leadership. He reminded everyone that mistakes must become lessons, not secrets. Tom was recognized privately for his professionalism. He accepted the acknowledgement humbly. He believed the real reward was progress. Life continued and seasons changed. The memory of flashing lights faded, but the lesson stayed strong. Mark found a new path within the system. His journey was different now, but meaningful. He focused on growth and understanding. The department continued evolving slowly but steadily. Awareness became part of everyday practice. Tom returned home one evening and stood by his window. The street below was quiet and peaceful. He reflected on how close everything had come to tragedy. He felt grateful for restraint, patience, and leadership. The night had tested everyone involved. It revealed flaws and strengths alike. The rain that once soaked the street now felt symbolic. It had washed away illusions and revealed truth. The city moved forward carrying that lesson quietly. Change did not come loudly, but it came steadily. Tom rested knowing his calm had mattered. The chief rested knowing accountability had mattered. Even Mark rested knowing the truth had changed him. The story did not end with anger or victory. It ended with growth and responsibility. And that was enough.